Welcome everyone to Studio 43, Transformations in Foundation series, where we discuss the forces that are transforming our lives and which bring us together as people. Today, we're going to be talking about technological transformations and threats. My name is Eva Chiang. I'm the Director of Evaluation and Research here at the Bush Center, where, as you might imagine, we take things like technology and data very seriously. As I was thinking about this session, I realized I actually use technology to create a ton of data on a daily basis, and I bet you do too. Let me give you an example. I'm a runner, so this morning I got up, I put on this watch, and I went for a run. When I got home, I used a digital code to get back into my house. I'll be honest with you, I have no idea where the physical key to my house is. By the time I was out of the shower, my watch had uploaded my run data to a service I subscribed to, and I already had a message telling me exactly how many miles I should run tomorrow and how fast I should run them. I also had a text message from a good friend who saw my route, and she said, "Hey, let's meet up this weekend and run that same route." When I got in my car, I asked my car which route should I take to work to avoid the most traffic. Yes, we are talking to our cars now. It's like living with the Jetsons. I also asked my car to go ahead and order my Starbucks because I didn't want to wait in line. My route had a toll road. I get on the toll road, a camera takes a picture of my front license plate. I'm sure a bill is being generated as we speak. It will be sent to me and it will be automatically paid by my bank account. I will never see that bill. I get to Starbucks, my cell phone remembers the Wi-Fi, it connects, I send a quick email, grab my drink, come over to the Bush Center, and I enter this very secure building with an electronic badge. Y'all, look at all that data that I created before 7:30 a.m. this morning. I love data. It's why I have this job. It makes my life easier. However, if I sit and I think about it too hard, it is a little creepy. Where does all that data go? Who has access to it? And what are they using it for? And I had this thought. If I wanted to delete that digital trail that I created this morning, do I even have the authority to do that? And then I hear stories on the news, and I bet you've heard these too. This major bank was hacked. That large corporation lost sensitive customer data. This is one of my favorite, a relatively new Pentagon policy that bans this kind of wearable technology because it turns out that feature I love where my friend can see my route and meet up with me is not such a good idea when you have soldiers running around secure military bases uploading their routes, right? And some governments have taken this too far. In China, they're actually assigning their citizens a social credit ranking based on some of that big data that I mentioned. And what happens if you have a bad ranking score? Well, they will prevent you from getting on trains and planes and traveling inside and outside of the country. So we're living in an amazing time with amazing technological advances. However, could some of those technological advances be a weakness, not just to me and you individually, but to our national security? So we have a lot of questions about this that we want answered. Luckily, we have two fantastic experts who are going to come out and help us answer some of these questions. I want to let you know, you will have a chance to answer questions, so have them ready if you have some questions. Our first panelist is Mr. Peter Altabef, Chairman of the Board of Unisys Corporation, and importantly to this discussion, he is a member of the President's National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee, where he co-chairs the Cybersecurity Moonshot initiative. And if you've never heard about that, that's okay, you're gonna learn about it today. Very importantly, Peter actually just won a very prestigious award called the Eagle Award for his work in helping us make the internet safer. We also have Secretary Michael Chertoff. We all know him as the former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security under President George W. Bush, where he worked on things like border security, immigration policy. He spearheaded the first national cybersecurity initiative. And prior to that, he led the investigation of our 9/11 terrorist attacks. So, will you please help me in welcoming our guests to the stage? Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Chertoff. Okay, thank you. You heard that very scary introduction that I just gave both of you. And in preparing for this session, Secretary Chertoff, I read your book, Exploding Data, Reclaiming Our Cybersecurity in the Digital Age. And one thing that stunned me is how much data we actually produce as individual citizens. So can you talk about what do you think would surprise people in the audience about how their data is being used?
Well, thank you, Eva. And I think people describe data as the new oil or the new gold. It is probably the most precious natural resource. But here's a surprise. Even I got yesterday. I was reading the Washington Post, and there's a story about an application called Ovia, which maybe some of you heard of. Apparently this application, which is essentially commissioned by employers, allows or perhaps pressures employees, female employees, to log everything relating to pregnancies, efforts to get pregnant, how the pregnancy is going, and when the baby is born, birth weight, and all the characteristics of the baby. The idea is presented as this is supposed to help you maximize the possibility of a safe and healthy pregnancy. But the employer gets access to the data, which is theoretically anonymized, but is quite detailed about every facet of your temperature, what you're eating, what your heart rate is, and any indicators with respect to the health of the fetus. All of this becomes part of the app. And for those who want to kind of put a lot of faith in the idea that the data is anonymized, I have two words to say to you: Cambridge Analytica. I mean, the reality is we generate, often willingly, sometimes with only imperfect knowledge, and sometimes completely unwittingly, enormous amounts of data. And the thing to remember is, it's not just kept in silos. It is often combined, either up in the cloud, so there's visibility across all of the silos, or people sell it. There's a marketplace for this. And so that winds up giving a granular view of the way we live, far beyond what even George Orwell could have imagined when he wrote 1984.
And so that's from the individual level, right? We sign up for these apps, we get our data collected. But Peter, tell us about the national perspective. You're in this a lot, you're doing a lot of advising. So what are you seeing from the national perspective, and how are people wrapping their minds around this?
So, Eva, that's a great question. From the national perspective, I think the biggest question we have is, when does the United States have its Sputnik moment around cyber? And by that, Sputnik was the first satellite into space. It went in 1957. Everyone expected it to be an American satellite, and the Russians beat us to it. And that was the wake-up call that started a lot of other things. And the question really is for us, are we going to wait for an actual Sputnik, or are we going to start acting now ahead of that? So, you know, one could argue 2014, 21 million Americans had their records stolen, and the records went very deep. Almost all federal employees, people with security clearances. My security clearance file's 100 pages. It's gone. So that wasn't enough for us to have a Sputnik moment. To the Secretary's point about personal data, in 2017, we had 148 million Americans lost their Equifax credit data. But it was more than just credit reports. It was social security numbers, it was telephone numbers, it was addresses, it was pretty deep. None of that has moved us as a country. So there's a framework called the Cia Triad. And CIA is not the intelligence division. It's confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility. And so when we think of confidentiality, it's exactly what the Secretary was just talking about. People taking data, people taking the OPM data, people taking the Equifax data, people taking the biology data that the Secretary referred to. That doesn't seem to be enough to trigger this Sputnik moment. So the next level of that triad is integrity. So what happens when we move from someone taking data to actually manipulating that data and then using it back at us for bad purposes? As an example, you're a hospital patient, and you're someone that is either a target of someone who wants to do harm, or it's just a terrorist who wants to make an example of you. And you have a certain blood type. Well, they've infiltrated the data. On the operating table, they change the blood type. So the surgeon thinks that you have a different blood type and gives you different blood. So that would be a manipulation of the data. The third would be accessibility. And so that, obviously, we're aware that certain countries have infected our power grid with software and firmware. It's not being used today. But if that software and firmware were to be used, and if it was effective, which is unknown, then you could have an accessibility problem in shutting the power grid. So 2 countries have had their Sputnik moment. So Estonia with an attack on their financial system, and Ukraine with an attack on their power system. If you live in Estonia or the Ukraine today, you've had your Sputnik moment. They are extremely aware of these issues. The real question for us is, do we wait or do we act now?
And by the way, just to add on the integrity example you gave, imagine you have an automated system that is handling your blood transfusion or some kind of infusion therapy, and that has the data altered, and there's not even a human being to look at it and kind of raise a question about it.
So that's great. And Peter, you brought up the bad guys. And I think we've all seen the scary movie where a terrorist takes over our grid. And it reminds me of this morning when our CEO, Ken Hirsch, was talking about this Geneva Convention idea that we have for international warfare. So, Michael, what do you think about that? Are there norms currently for this kind of attack? Should there be norms? And if so, what's an example of one of those norms?
Well, so there's a bit of a dispute, not surprisingly, between the Western countries and Russia and China about the applicability of international law to cyber conflict. I won't say cyber warfare. The Russians and the Chinese are more skeptical. I think most Western countries believe that the traditional laws of war and armed conflict would apply in cyberspace. The challenge is deciding when you've crossed the threshold between ordinary cyber malicious activity into the realm of conflict. But there's also a more general issue about norms, whether there are some things even the Russians and the Chinese could agree with the West about. For example, there's work being done, I'm somewhat involved in this, in developing norms on not attacking the availability or integrity of data on the financial system, the global financial system. And because every country in the global economy needs to use that system in order to transact business, there may be enough of a shared interest that you could get a global agreement on this. Or, for example, the Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace, which I'm co-chairing, has published a norm on protecting the public core of the internet, trying to get general acknowledgement that we don't take steps that would undermine the general availability or integrity of the internet as it functions globally. So I'm without being naive or Pollyannish, I do think there are areas of shared interest, but frankly, because of the difficulties you have sometimes in drawing lines on where a cyber attack begins or how you attribute, it's going to be more complicated than in the physical world.
So, and you mentioned businesses have an interest in agreeing to this. What about governments? Do governments also have a shared interest in signing up for these norms?
I think so, because governments also depend on the availability of, for example, a public core to deliver basic services. So in much the same way as most countries agree, except for rogue nations, agreeing with the general outlines of the Geneva Convention, even if they're not always honored, I think there's enough mutual interest in some of these norms so that governments will have an incentive to participate. In many ways, though, the private sector may lead. And because much of the infrastructure is in private hands, that's actually a very powerful issue. We've seen it in our own country, where a number of the cyber companies decided after the Snowden revelations that they were going to be very transparent and punctilious about making sure that whenever there was a request from the government to access data, it was done strictly according to the law, turning square corners. And that's actually had a real impact in the world. So the companies really can be leaders in this.
That's great, okay. So Peter, let's talk about our government. I mentioned when I was introducing you that you co-chair the Cybersecurity Moonshot Committee, and I'm just interested to learn more about that, and where does your work stand now?
Well, thanks, Eva. You know, to follow on Michael's comment, we early on in the creation of the National Cybersecurity Moonshot Project realized while it should be led by the government, it can't be a government effort. So industry, academia, people, it's really what we call a whole of nation effort. We think that's necessary. The defining statement of the Moonshot is to create a safe and secure internet for critical services by 2028. Safe and secure doesn't mean perfect. There's not going to be perfection, but it's demonstrably different than where we are now. It is about the internet, because that's where all of this commerce takes place. It is about critical services, which is what the Secretary just referred to, whether it's critical government services, the financial sector. And 2028 is a really important part of that. So we purposefully picked 10 years out for a couple of reasons. The first reason is there's so much important work being done in cybersecurity every day. You have companies doing patches, you have government agencies strengthening their system, but they're patches. You have 5 days to deal with a zero-day vulnerability. You really only have limited tools. The tools you have are technology. If you go out 10 years, all of a sudden, you're not limited to just technology patches. You can look at all of the tools that we have as a society. We'll talk about that in a second. The second reason for going out 10 years is there's a bit of that Ken talked about as well this morning, which is the unknowable. So we really wanted to set up a framework which includes an organization, it includes a methodology, it includes funding. It's the whole package of how are we as a society going to stand up the ability not only to deal with the threats we have today, but the threats that we foresee coming, such as the ability of quantum computers to basically obliterate any existing encryption, but also threats we don't see yet. So it is really, how do we establish as a society, we care enough about this that we're going to do it right. And so when we did that, interesting things happened. Technology is important, and we identified 4 key technologies that we knew were both offensive and defensive, in the sense that if we use them correctly, we could use these technologies to protect ourselves. But the bad guys could absolutely use these technologies to attack us. So these are double-edged swords. 5G network is one, artificial intelligence the second, biometrics the third, and the fourth is kind of the big kahuna, which is quantum computing, which Ken also talked about this morning. So we really focused on those 4 technologies, but we went beyond technology. So the next thing we focused on, out of these 6 pillars, was privacy. So how do we build privacy into the next generation of how we establish protections on the internet from the get-go? Not as an afterthought, but build it in now. And in a second way, how do we think about privacy from the standpoint of accountability and responsibility? So how do we make sure that we protect against this kind of data that the Secretary talks about from being misused? The third pillar was education. And we've dealt with education really 2 ways. The first is, how do we make sure that as a society, we know what good cyber hygiene is? All right? There's an education to tell people what that means. The second part of education is really the capabilities we have in terms of the people who can build these next generation systems. Do we have enough people going through STEM classes in high school, in college? When people graduate college or graduate school, and if they happen to be foreign students, do we hand them a green card and say, we want you to stay and help us? So education is one of those elements. The next element, and the fourth element, was really interesting. It was human behavior. And I got to tell you, sitting in these briefings with these wonderful leading technologists and having them sit in the same room as academics who really understand human behavior was kind of a revelation. So you can educate people on what good cyber hygiene is, but will they actually do it? So the human behavior pillar is about getting people to understand the importance of it and then doing it. The last two are what you'd expect, I think, and one of them is policy. And so as we think about incentives, whether it's for industry, whether it's for people, whether it's government agencies, what laws and regulations, what kind of policy do we have to adopt that basically says, this is our moonshot for the 21st century, this is our thing. And then the final pillar is what we call ecosystems, because none of the other pillars actually works as a standalone. You have to get in the seams of these and really understand how do you put it all together. Last element, Eva, going back again to Ken's comment, the one big difference between the original moonshot and what we have now is when President Kennedy announced it, we did not have all the technology to actually get a person to the moon and safely back. He didn't know how we were going to do it. We as a country did not know. But we did know where the moon would be. We knew exactly where it was going to be at any moment of time for the next 100 years. With our moonshot, similarly, we don't have all the technology answers, but we actually don't know exactly where this moving target is going to be. So it has to be a very robust company or countrywide effort, because we're going to have to be nimble, and we're going to have to realize that this is going to change during the course of those 10 years.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And you actually caught my attention when you talked about human behavior. Because I know I'm supposed to drink a certain amount of water and exercise a certain amount of time to stay healthy, but I don't do it, right? So can you give us an example of one of those human behaviors that was brought up that people might not use, even though we know we're supposed to?
Well, if you think about, at a basic individual level, one of the most important things you can do is patch early and patch often. So, and of course, then there's password maintenance and all of that. So there are, pretty obvious things that you just need to make sure people understand, why is it important to patch? Why is it important to have a good password structure? Why is it good not to have all of your technology or all of your information in one place? But then you have to get people inspired to do it. Right. We're coming up with videos. We're coming up with other ways to actually get people to really kind of understand it and then want to actually do it. We're trying to make it fun. So I'm betting a whole bunch of people are going to be changing their passwords and making them more secure after the session, right? So Michael, how is this different? The recommendations he's talking about, these are brand new. You just handed them to the president, as I understand it. How does this sound different or very similar to when you spearheaded a campaign like this?
Well, we've been talking about doing this for years, and the message has been out for years. And I think one of the things we need to think about is maybe we need to also design the systems to be a little more human-friendly. So let me take the two examples that Peter just gave. The reality is everybody knows you're supposed to have a very long password and a different password for every account and change them frequently. How many people are actually capable of doing that and remembering if they have a lot of different accounts? We actually need to start to think about moving to a system of identity management that is less complicated and doesn't rely on some secret knowledge of a password or a code, but is based on some combination of biometrics, behavior, the nature of the device, and a number of different things that don't require a lot of human effort. That's designing a more user-friendly system. Or on the issue of patches. How do you assure people when they get something that appears to be a legitimate patch, it's actually not malware masquerading as a patch? So part of the challenge here, to be honest, is on those who are designing the security elements to think through what you pointed out earlier, the psychology of human beings. We're not designing for engineers who spend a lot of time loving how complicated things can be. We're designing them for civilians who need to be able to operate in the real world.
Right, exactly. And so I promised this group that I was going to open it up to questions. We do have mic runners going up and down the aisle. So this is your opportunity to ask those burning questions you have that have been brought up as we've had this session to two of our great experts here. So let's see what questions we might have from the audience. And it's a little hard to see, so I'll thank you for the lights. Okay, we have one back here. The microphone's coming. Because we're live feeding this, we're going to wait until the microphone gets to you to make sure everybody online can hear your question.
Hi, thank you. I have a question because I think about my mother every day and her iPhone, which she doesn't need, and her iPad, which she also doesn't need. She still has an AOL email account. She opens attachments. What can I do, or where can I send her educationally to make her understand that when you click on that attachment, someone may end up with your credit card number, or God forbid, whatever personal information that you have, which is all in your iPhone, which I wish you wouldn't have bought in the first place.
Well, that's a great question. Now, they are designing and marketing various kinds of devices now that are much simpler. In fact, I saw an ad for something that basically, this is designed to get people to kind of spend less time on the screen. But essentially, it's a telephone and texting. It doesn't have access to the internet. It doesn't have email. And therefore, the amount of data on it is less. I actually think there's a market for that. And it may be that the answer is to find for someone who either doesn't need or perhaps shouldn't need access to all the data and keeping it in one place, something that can certainly be there for emergencies and for communication that you need to have, but isn't going to be a repository of data that's as attractive to a bad guy as what you're describing.
And again, just to follow up, that iPhone that she has, she doesn't need it now, but she probably will need it in the future. Because when we talk about the passwords, one of the four critical technologies that we have identified for the Moonshot is biometrics. And that is all about moving away from a password that nobody can remember to basically giving you a score based on all of how you hold the phone, where you are, how you punch the buttons. I mean, there's a whole lot of data you can get that really makes sure it's you. And unfortunately, you don't have all of that with just a PC on a desk. So even people who are using PCs one day may actually have to authenticate with a phone because there's just so much more data on that phone. Anyone here who thinks that their mother's maiden name is a good password? It is not. In fact, it's hard to really think about when you use your mother's maiden name for almost anything, but not for a password. They're known things out there.
So I have elementary age children who are dying for cell phones, right? And I think I'm going to start calling them repositories of data instead of cell phones, just to get that idea across that they hold so much data. I think we had a question here in the front row.
So the current version of the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act expires at the end of 2020. We're beginning discussions now with various components of the federal government. Cyber was really not at the level of threat 5 years ago. The last version was done, certainly not in 2001 when it was first created after 9/11. And we as the insurance industry are trying to have conversations with Treasury on this, and I would just encourage you to recognize the need to collaborate with Treasury, because it may be a little bit siloed in the areas that you're working on. But I suspect cyber threats are going to be even more important as we talk about fundamental disruptions to the U.S. economy in the next 5 years than it has been in the previous 5 years.
So if I could just start. It's a great question. You're right. This is a newer question than we've had before. About 20% of the significant cyber attacks are now associated with nation-state action. And so one of the insurance questions, because insurance is critical for companies, and cyber insurance is becoming more and more important, is a typical insurance policy has an exception for an act of war. And so will typical insurance companies for cyber actually protect companies when they need it most, which is when they're actually attacked by the most powerful of enemies, which are nation states? So I raise that as a question that is very much at the forefront of some of these discussions.
Now, what's going to be complicated about that is, of course, When is something an act of war? What is war? And what do you do with hybrid warfare, where, for example, as in Estonia, the Russians, when we called them on the 2007 attack on Estonia, said, oh, it wasn't us, it was patriotic hackers. Now, if you've read some of the indictments that came out of the Mueller investigation, you see the Russian intelligence agency and the criminal groups actually work like this together. Something else that would be helpful, though, we have the Safety Act for counterterrorism technologies, which, if you satisfy certain metrics, means that you get a liability cap. If notwithstanding your technology, there's a successful attack. I've advocated we ought to have that for cyber, which means we ought to have a set of standards, and then technologies or processes that meet those standards should afford the company or the enterprise some cap on liability, which would then make it easier to insure them.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Oh, up here in the front.
It's a fascinating topic. We're all getting paranoid, you know. I feel like my phone is listening to me, my TV's watching me. In fact, I can merely talk about a destination now, and an ad for that trip shows up on my Facebook. So is that true, and how do we protect ourselves?
Well, unfortunately, it is a little true. You know, there have been stories about Echo and similar types of devices you have in your home that are you're supposed to say, you know, Echo or Siri or whoever, or Alexa, you know, turn on the TV, that sometimes these wind up recording you. And there was one story about someone who was recorded, and then the recording was sent to a third party. Some of these are design problems. Some of these, to be honest, particularly as you get to the Internet of Things, are questions for you about, do you really want this device? I mean, I got to be honest, I'm perfectly capable of turning on the TV myself. I don't need Echo or Alexa to do it for me. So part of my argument to people is you ought to be mindful. Where technology is important and helpful to you, and I do wear an Apple Watch, that's great. But I wouldn't blindly accept the view that we want to be having ourselves surrounded by smart devices when the risk-reward ratio may be suboptimal. That's good.
That may be the
Well, and there have been stories even about televisions being able to detect, for example, where your eyes are when a particular ad is on, so that the vendor can determine what kinds of ads are more compelling to you. And it may be at some point we do wind up with legislation or regulation that says you must tell the consumer with clarity exactly what is being done with their data and what is being collected as a condition of being able to sell. In much the same way as you have to list ingredients for food that have to be accurate.
Right. So now we're all pretty terrified, I think. But this session is called Technological Transformations, and I talked about how we're living in an amazing time. So let's end it with you telling us what you're excited about, right? Because this technology does help us. It makes our life easier. It makes us healthier. So you pick the order you want to go in, but tell us what you're excited about.
I'll start, I guess. This is a two-edged conversation. We have to be deliberate. We have to invest the time and any energy and money to protect ourselves, but we can't run scared. Mm-hmm. Ken mentioned again in the first speech the importance of our system of government, the importance of democracy, the importance of our economy, and this capitalism, right? We encourage innovation. We encourage movement of capital. It's okay for people to fail in this world, and then you restart. All of that gives us a tremendous advantage in using these technologies to create jobs, to build new economies, and to advance humanity. We're 21 years into the Google search engine. We have not yet hit a dozen years for the iPhone. And you now have most of the knowledge of humanity literally at your fingertips. So where we go with that is it's hugely positive. The four technologies I mentioned earlier, very quickly. So 5G. 5G creates a mesh network. It's much faster. It's much more reliable. It will be the enabler for autonomous cars. Autonomous cars don't really become fully enabled on wide scale without 5G. Biometrics is going to make us much more secure than your mother's maiden name, right? Artificial intelligence. We may not all use Alexa. Alexa is 4 years old. And so, we've gone from, the excitement of being able to say, I want to hear a specific song, to, voice recognition has enormous potential. And all of this kind of takes a backseat to quantum. You heard about the computing power of quantum. There are already studies about what it will do to machine learning. There are already studies about what it will do to genetic research. So yes, you have the downside of it could defeat current encryption. You have to build quantum protected encryption. And then you have to go do all the good stuff. So I would say we need not lose our courage. We have the right system of government. We've got the right economy. We are just missing a focus on helping us defend ourselves.
I agree with that. I think, look, I mean, I may make a little bit of fun at the expense of Alexa and Echo, but in the area of health, for example, in the area of the environment and mitigating climate change, things of that sort, we're going to find tremendous potential with some of these technological tools, which will both make us more efficient and healthier. I mean, one example is it may be we're at the point now that when you have an atrial fibrillation, which is a very episodic type of heart ailment that can ultimately cause a stroke, the ability to wear a device that would detect that and have an emergency vehicle come right away will become a life-saving thing. So I do think there's a lot of potential. There's now discussion about smart cities, which would reduce pollution, make energy use more efficient, and actually make life more pleasant because you won't have to wait in traffic. That being said, I think there's an important dimension to this. Security has to be built in by design. What has not worked in the past is let's push something out to the consumer, and then afterwards we'll think, oh, by the way, we didn't secure it, or we didn't think about how it gets controlled, and now we've got to run around and retrofit it. So to me, there's still an enormous amount of promise in this, but the promise requires us to be thinking about issues like security and privacy at the design stage and at the implementation stage. Finally, I'd say this. You don't have to aspire to perfect security that you'll never get penetrated. I guarantee you, no matter how good the security is, you will. Just like you can't ask your doctor, doctor, how can I make sure I never get sick? You're going to get sick. That's why you have defenses in depth. You have an immune system. We need to build immune systems within our technology. We will be penetrated, but that's where resilience and internal defenses allow you to mitigate the problem and to recover from it. And so a realistic understanding of what security means, coupled with an appropriate design stage, I think allows us to really capitalize on the promise of this technology.
Okay, perfect. And one of the things that makes me feel hopeful after getting to know both of you is I truly think we have some of the brightest minds in our country and in the world thinking about these issues really deeply. So I do have one more announcement for you, but before that, can you thank me for, join me in thanking our panelists for joining us and spending their time on this topic with us today.